After climbing to the top of the corporate ladder, she finally made love a priority.
Whatever she was missing, he was able to fulfill it. They were attached at the hip. Really, the only time they separated was when both of them went to work.
But a fateful December night will tear them apart forever.
Jay, just bring up some Pepsi tape.
There was blood all around her, blood on the walls.
She has been dead for quite some time.
When the men closest to her point the finger at each other, who's telling the truth?
He's a stalker. I really don't trust him at all.
This guy is like real jealous, controlling.
He was blackmailing her and extorting her for money.
She gave him everything, money, bought a car for him, pays for everything.
Get out! Before I call the cops.
It got to the point where I just couldn't be there.
He was a very violent person, the definition of dangerous.
December 2019. With only days until Christmas, residents in West Palm Beach, Florida are preparing for the holiday season.
This particular area of Florida is surrounded by marinas, yachts, and it's right next door to Palm Beach County, which is home to a lot of American billionaires.
It's known as a very upscale, safe area.
But on the evening of December 16th, as most residents are fast asleep, the quiet tranquility is shattered after the clock strikes midnight.
The department received a 911 call from an individual they identified as Ronald Gamble.
West Palm PD, what's your emergency?
Come quick, my girlfriend needs help. Please.
He had come home from being away for the weekend and found a bloody scene.
He finds his girlfriend, 52-year-old Rochelle Demings, laying in a pool of her own blood.
Oh my God, Rochelle, she's not breathing.
West Palm Beach police were immediately dispatched to the scene.
Come on outside for me. Okay, you didn't touch her at all. Have you moved her at all? You checked her or anything? Okay, is anybody else in the home?
I don't think so.
Okay.
When the officer looks inside the door, he is taken aback by what he sees.
Oh.
The officer can tell there's no use trying CPR.
It looks like Rochelle has been dead for quite some time.
Jay, just bring up some Pepsi tape.
At that point, the officer radios down to homicide detectives to start an investigation.
All right, we got the medics. They're gonna come check on her, but it doesn't look good, bud.
"52-year-old mother of two, Rochelle Demings, was as accomplished as they come.
She had 2 bachelor's degrees, 2 associate's degrees. She also went on to get her master's degree.
She was a bright light, a walking smile and inspiration to anyone that she crossed paths with.
She was a very accomplished federal employee with the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs.
She was the chief of HIMSS at the West Palm Beach VA. HIMSS is Health Information Management Service.
Her employees describe her as someone who was always willing to help, always willing to teach them how to elevate their career as well.
Even though she was a chief, she would be alongside of us working every day if we got behind. She was down in the trenches with us.
But despite the success she'd built, something was still missing.
Her kids were grown, and after 20 years of marriage, she divorced their father. So she was missing companionship, she was missing romance.
Although Rochelle was very well respected in her industry, she got lonely.
So Rochelle decided to take action.
She went online, and it didn't take long until she was matched with Ronald Gamble.
Ronald wasn't as esteemed or decorated as Rochelle. However, he did work different temp agency jobs.
On their first date, sparks flew.
He seemed to be a really nice guy, and he was very supportive of all of the things that Rochelle had going on in her life.
You know, you are really something else. I was just glad I'm able to make you smile, you know?
He was very charming. He made Rochelle laugh. He was able to make Rochelle feel like that whatever piece she was missing, he was able to fulfill it.
And after that first date, their relationship moved fast.
Ronald was constantly at Rochelle's house. They were tied together at the hip.
He moved in with her pretty quickly.
After 3 years of dating, they actually upgraded their lifestyle and they moved into a beautiful, amazing new condo in West Palm Beach.
But after the couple had spent only a few weeks in their new home, detectives are there to begin a homicide investigation.
We were confronted with Miss Demings, who's laying on the floor right in the breezeway or the foyer area of this apartment. There's a large quantity of blood on the ground, and she's obviously deceased.
It was absolutely a terrible scene.
It's clear to police that whatever happened in that apartment, Rochelle died a violent death.
The only way that you could get around her was to jump over her. So it was a very difficult scene to work because all of the blood.
It was really hard for the police to find out the source of where her blood was coming from, but it did appear as though the blood was coming from her head.
And from the looks of it, Rochelle's been dead for a few days.
There was lots of blood. It was dark blood, which looked like it had been sitting there for a while. Some looked like it was dried because of the length of time that it had been there.
There was actually some pieces of mail that were in very close proximity to her body at the time.
They wonder if she was holding the letters when she was attacked and dropped them.
But aside from the gory scene in the entryway, nothing in the apartment seems amiss.
Nothing appeared to be stolen.
The door wasn't broken, so it really didn't seem like somebody entered that shouldn't be there.
Her boyfriend's the one that found her?
Yes. He's been very cooperative so far.
Okay.
Detectives are eager to speak with Ronald themselves to learn more.
They're very curious to see if he knew about who would be able to cause this kind of harm to Rochelle.
Or did he have something to do with it?
After years of prioritizing her successful career, 52-year-old Rochelle Demings had found love at long last.
She fell head over heels in love with a man named Ronald Gamble. The two had just moved into a place together in West Palm Beach.
They wanted to spend as much time as they could together.
But now, the couple's new condo is a crime scene.
Rochelle was located on the floor of the condo with some type of head injury that produced a lot of blood.
As word spreads to Rochelle's friends, family, and co-workers, they're heartbroken.
So I get to work, and people were emotional and everything. They grab me, and they tell me that Rochelle is dead. My whole professional world had collapsed. Like, what the F you mean she dead? So, didn't make it through the day at all. Another person ended up taking me home.
Rochelle's boyfriend, Ronald Gamble, also seems shaken up.
Ronald was the one that called 911 after he returned to the condo and found Rochelle.
Detectives are very curious to see if he knew about who would be able to cause this kind of harm to Rochelle.
Or did he have something to do with it?
Detectives bring Ronald back to the station for an official statement.
He had no problem speaking to us at all. He's very talkative. He's very open about things.
How long have you two been together?
I would say 3 years now.
He explained that he and Miss Demings had been dating for a few years and that they had just moved to this apartment.
But Ronald says there's one person who had recently come between them, Rochelle's 27-year-old son, Dan.
They had a wonderful relationship up and until the son came from Ohio.
What happened was, okay, I lived with her for a while, and then all of a sudden, her son comes out of nowhere. Her son is a stalker.
When detectives ask Ronald to elaborate, he starts at the beginning.
When Dan decided to move from Cleveland, Ohio to Florida, he had nowhere else to go. So Rochelle, being the mother that she is, she allowed Dan to come home to her home. But Ronald was very reluctant against that.
After Dan moved in, Ronald says the entire dynamic between him and Rochelle shifted.
He said they had started having disagreements and arguing.
He's an adult, Rochelle. He needs to grow up and get his own place.
You just don't understand. That is my only son.
We've never had any trouble before he came, never. He's always involved in our life. Like, he won't just get out of our lives.
And it became an issue that she gave him everything, money, bought a car for him, pays for his phone bill, pays for everything.
Ronald got fed up. He made the statement that if Dan wasn't going to pay bills, then Dan had to get out. Dan did not like that.
Do it, get out. Hey, what's going on in here?
You're 27. She doesn't owe you. I keep telling him that. Every time he tries, I said, bro, get out. Your mom don't owe you, bro. Get from around us. You're grown.
Then Ronald says things took a turn for the worst.
He bust me in the head with a hot sauce bottle.
Get out before I call the cops.
And I called the police out. And I told them, hey, man, the guy that assaulted me.
Ronald ended up pressing charges, and Dan was arrested. He was charged with aggravated battery and taken to jail.
But Ronald claims Dan's volatile behavior continued.
A few weeks later, Ronald and Rochelle woke up to the sound of glass smashing. When they went to see what it was, or who it was Dan.
What the hell are you doing?
What are you doing?
He punched through their window, trying to get in.
I don't know why he did it, but he did it and cut his arm all up. I said, May, you gotta remove him from our lives. We can't live like this. You're a professional, I work. He doesn't want to do nothing with his life.
Get out before I call the cops.
Once again, Ronald had Dan arrested.
So it's been month after month, we've had the police over there on him within a year, about at least 20 or 30 times. I really don't trust him at all.
And Ronald says the apartment complex also became fed up with the drama.
Because of the issues that the son and he were having and the trouble that it was causing, they had asked them to leave.
They were evicted from their apartment.
Ronald felt like Dan was ruining what he had with Rochelle, so that led him to file a restraining order against Dan.
Within a month, the couple had found a new place to live. And with Dan out of the picture, Ronald says it felt like a new beginning.
They were starting new, and her son would not know where they lived.
But Ronald says he believes Dan found them once again.
He's obsessed with his mom. And I don't know, I've seen some other weird things I don't want to say. Makes me think, other things are going on too.
Say it. What are you going to say?
Nothing could prepare them for what came out of Ronald's mouth next.
He talks about some wild accusations.
That's nasty. No, That's not who she was as a person.
Detectives in West Palm Beach are investigating the murder of 52-year-old Rochelle Demings.
She was found in a pool of blood by her boyfriend, Ronald Gamble. It was clear she had been brutally attacked.
And now Ronald is raising suspicion about Rochelle's own son.
He claims that Dan was jealous of his relationship with Rochelle.
According to Ronald, Dan had been violent towards them in the past, and they even had to file a restraining order against him.
He's obsessed with his mom. And I don't know, I've seen some other weird things I don't want to say. Makes me think, other things are going on too.
Say it. What are you gonna say?
He believed that Rochelle and Dan didn't have a typical mother-son relationship.
He talks about some wild accusations about the possibility that Miss Demings and her son were engaged in sexual activity.
I think they were sleeping together a whole lot of times.
He would say that she would be on the phone with him, and he believed that they were having phone sex or something to that extent.
Anybody that stays on the phone with their son all the time, there's got to be something else going on.
It's a shocking claim, and one detectives take with a grain of salt.
That's not Rochelle. That's nasty. No. That's not who she was as a person. That's not who she was as a mother.
There's absolutely no proof, none. But Ronald Gamble felt so strongly that this woman should not be taking this good care of her adult son.
Ronald says 3 days ago, he found evidence that Rochelle was still taking care of Dan, even after they moved into their new condo to get away from him.
He was going through the mail on Friday the 13th.
He found mail addressed to Dan, and that set him off. He said there was no reason why Dan's mail should be coming to that address. Dan wasn't supposed to even know the address.
He will not leave us alone. And when I seen that mail with his name on it, and so now once I seen that, I said, he must have a key here. So now I'm heated.
He confronted Rochelle about what he discovered.
What's this doing in our mail?
I don't know. He even asked Rochelle if she had planned on giving a key to Dan to their new condo.
Tell me the truth. Did you give him a key?
What? No!
She kind of gets like, what are you talking about? She was like, oh, don't worry about that. So I'm like, really?
Rochelle tried to reassure Ronald that no, Dan had no idea of where they lived. However, Ronald was still infuriated. He was convinced that Dan was gonna ruin their lives again.
Rochelle, this is supposed to be a fresh start for us. I can't keep doing this.
Ronald says at that point, he just wanted to leave, but there was one problem.
His car wasn't working at the time.
I said, you know what? Just give me the key to your car, and I'm gonna go to Orlando and have somebody to come and get my car out here.
He said Rochelle jumped in front of him, preventing him from leaving.
And she was like talking. To be honest, she was talking. So when I get by the door and getting ready to go out, she kind of pushed the door back, and I said, why you do that? And she slapped the out of me.
He said what happened next, he snapped.
In his words, he said, I hit her.
And I'm not gonna lie, I hit her. I hit her.
In December of 2019, as most people are preparing for the upcoming holiday season, detectives in West Palm Beach are listening to a harrowing story from 48-year-old Ronald Gamble.
He admits that on Friday the 13th, he and Rochelle Demings got into a huge argument about her son. This was just 3 days before Rochelle's body was discovered.
With the argument becoming more and more heated, Ronald says he tried to leave.
So when I get by the door and getting ready to go out, she kind of pushed the door back, and I said, why you do that? And she slapped the out of me.
Ronald says that's when he snapped.
And I'm not gonna lie, I hit her. I hit her I hit her with my hand, and I might have hit her in her head really hard. I'm gonna be honest with you. So after I seen her do that, she fell to the ground, like right there.
But Ronald insists she was still alive.
You see her get up?
No, sir, to be honest, because I locked the door, trying to get out of there.
He got out the door and locked it behind him and never looked back. He said he went to visit a friend in Orlando.
Did she call you at all?
Actually, to be honest with you, I turned my phone off because I'm so pissed off with what's going on with her.
So then you left to go to
Orlando.
He said he drove 2.5 hours to Orlando in Rochelle's car to stay with a friend and clear his head.
We asked him, did you hit her hard enough that you could have killed her?
You don't think you could have hit her hard enough to kill her?
Don't tell me that.
He said what he did could not have caused her death the way it happened.
Ronald insists that when he returned home after spending the weekend in Orlando, he fully expected to find his girlfriend alive and well.
By the time he returned on the 16th, he was ready to have a conversation with Rochelle.
When you came home tonight, what time did you get there?
I'm gonna say it's after 12. I don't know exactly what time it was, but it had to be after 12.
He said the door was locked.
So when you opened the door and you walk in, what happened?
Immediately, he saw Rochelle lying in a pool of blood.
I kind of freak out, but I opened the door and I was like, oh my God, you know, but I closed the door back. Because I don't know what's going. She's not moving. So I jump over her and I immediately get on the phone and call 911.
West Palm PD, what's your emergency?
Come quick, my girlfriend needs help, please.
Ronald insists the only person who could have done this to Rochelle was her son, Dan.
He has did stuff to his mom in my presence, and I would have to intervene. Man, that dude was doing so much stuff to us.
But detectives aren't buying Ronald's story, and their suspicions are further confirmed by the results of Rochelle's autopsy report.
The autopsy reveals that due to the decomposition of her body, she actually died 3 days before she was found, which was December 13th.
That was the same day that Ronald admits to hitting her.
Rochelle had 5 deep lacerations to the top of her skull. She had a contusion to her lip, severe swelling to her left eye, and fractures to the orbital bone on her left side. The fatal wound was a lateral skull fracture on the back of her skull that essentially cracked her head open.
What are the odds that on the same day Ronald admits to getting into a physical altercation with her, someone else came in and essentially beat her to death?
However, detectives aren't ready to arrest Ronald for the crime just yet.
And if I just simply made an arrest fast, without evidence, without doing DNA and phone records and what have you, that's gonna hurt us. And I didn't want to do that.
So, detectives follow up with Rochelle's son, Dan.
They let him know right away that Ronald was trying to pin the crime on him.
Mr. Gamble basically was saying he didn't do it. The only person he said, you.
Of course he does, sir.
Of course he did. So I have to come up here and talk to you about that.
Dan seems frustrated and offended that police even have to investigate Ronald's claims.
Had you and your mother ever gotten into a physical altercation before?
Never.
Do you have anything to do with your mother's death?
No, sir.
Dan says the only person who could have done this is Ronald Gamble.
Dan says that his mother's relationship with Ronald was rocky from the start, and it only got worse.
This guy is like a real jealous, controlling. You know, like, I used to call him the devil, and I meant that for a reason.
Detectives in West Palm Beach, Florida, are speaking with the son of Rochelle Demings after her boyfriend, Ronald Gamble, implicated him for her gruesome murder.
They see that he's very torn up about losing his mother. Rochelle was his best friend, and he's so hurt that he lost her.
Do you have anything to do with your mother's death?
No, sir.
Dan says he believes that Ronald Gamble was his mother's killer and that their relationship was problematic from the very beginning.
So they met off like a dating site, and it was rocky. This was before I came down there. It was rocky. She had kicked him out. You know, my mom, she was a sucker for love.
Dan says Ronald tried to isolate his mother from the rest of their family.
He told my mother it was disrespectful. He talked to me while he's around. Told my mother that she think my mother's having sex with me.
Yeah, he mentioned that. I was going to ask about that. Why would he think that?
Because the way the relationship me and my mother, I don't know about what he thinks of sex. But one, like I told me, my mother was like this. You know what I'm saying? That was my best friend. We was tight. You know what I'm saying?
Dan admits that he and Ronald got into some physical altercations in the past, but says Ronald was the aggressor.
Had he ever been violent with her before?
Yes.
How so? What happened?
I hit him in the head.
Rochelle!
What?
Your card keeps getting declined.
I don't know what happened.
You know how embarrassing?
He ran to the store for my mom and got her 2 bottles of wine. She didn't have enough on her card, so he felt like embarrassed, you know what I'm saying? So he talking crazy to her. I'm standing out of it for the most part.
But when Ronald started calling his mother names, Dan couldn't stay out of it any longer.
Dan saw that Mr. Gamble was just taking advantage of Miss Demings and her kind nature, and Dan would get really, really upset.
Hey! Watch how you talking to my mom like that, man. Who the hell are you talking to?
If y'all argue, you know what I'm saying? But don't call my mother name or none of that bullshit. So he, like, tried to help me up.
Dan says his mother moved in to defend him.
My mom came and grabbed me, like, you know, get off my son. He pushed her to the ground.
Dan said he wasn't going to sit by and watch Ronald do that to his mother, so he grabbed the closest thing, which was the hot sauce bottle.
So I hit him in the head, you know, busted his head open. And it was self-defense, though. You know, it really was. So it was just Satan, man.
Get out! Before I call the cops.
He says after that incident, he knew that he couldn't go back to his mother's house.
It got to the point where I just couldn't be there, you know what I'm saying?
But Dan continued keeping tabs on his mother, worried for her safety.
I heard them in there arguing.
You know how desperate? I don't know what stupid old good man.
Because I couldn't get in, you know, I had no key. He really, like, took my life over for real, like, ran, you know, and I think she was really scared.
He was so concerned about what was happening in the home, he did the next best thing that he thought he could do.
So I punched the window. Police that came that day. And fixed that stuff. My mom got kicked out for that. So, you know, once she got kicked out of there, it was kind of my fault.
Dan admits when Ronald and his mother moved into their new condo, she didn't share the location with him, but she had good reason.
It wasn't because she was afraid of her son. It was because she was afraid of Ronald. She was trying to protect Dan until she could figure out a way to get away from Ronald for good.
So how did Dan's mail end up at the new condo?
They said, well, if you didn't know where your mother was living, why are you getting mail to her new place?
And Dan explained to them, because he was technically homeless, the mail that he was receiving at the other apartment was being forwarded to the new condo.
Did she give you a key?
I never knew where she stayed.
Detectives are inclined to believe Dan's version of events, especially when they sit down with Rochelle's other family members.
That's her heart. She loved him more than anything in this world.
You don't think he's capable of doing something like that?
I don't think he's capable of doing something like that to his mother.
Instead, they echo Dan's sentiments that Ronald Gamble is the one responsible for Rochelle's death.
She made the statement about, if anything happened to me, this MF did it.
They told police that Rochelle was in an abusive relationship. She wanted to leave Ronald, but she had to be strategic.
Rochelle had had it, and she was done with this relationship. But as she told her friends and family members, she knew she couldn't just abruptly end it and walk away.
And Rochelle's family said she had good reason to be cautious.
Ronald was threatening to make her life hell if she tried to leave him.
She just kept saying he was blackmailing her. He was trying to exploit her for money, and he just wouldn't leave.
Ronald had some dirt on her that could possibly get her fired.
She had tried marijuana to help with her chronic nerve pain.
He ended up taking a picture of her smoking marijuana and then threatened to send it to her boss at the VA hospital. She had worked for the VA for over 30 years. She loved her job and she had so much to lose.
Ronald told Rochelle that she had to pay $1,200 to keep her secret.
And I'm like, you cannot get in trouble for what he's trying to blackmail you for. He can take a video of you smoking a cigarette and say it's weed. I'm like, only thing they can do is drug test you.
But Rochelle couldn't bear the idea of losing everything she'd worked for.
So she paid him $1,200.
Rochelle wanted to end it, but she knew he had a temper, so she was trying to do it delicately and to keep the peace. And some of her friends and family members got the impression that she was terrified of him.
She said, if anything happened to me, if I come up dead, if I come up missing, he did it.
And when detectives review surveillance from the evening of the murder, they feel even more confident in their case against Ronald Gamble.
We had video at the apartment complex, at least at the gates, to see what vehicles entered and exited and entered that night.
At no point does Dan or his vehicle enter the complex.
Homicide detectives in West Palm Beach investigating the mysterious death of 52-year-old Rochelle Demings believe that her live-in boyfriend, Ronald Gamble, is responsible for the crime.
Ronald tried to pin the crime on Rochelle's son, Dan. But during their investigation, police found his claims to be bogus.
Ms. Deming's son gave me his phone number, which we were able to use to see where he was on the night in question. His cell phone records show that he wasn't there.
Surveillance video from the apartment complex also proves Dan couldn't have been the person who killed his mother.
We had video at the apartment complex gates to see what vehicles exited and entered that night.
At no point does Dan or his vehicle enter the complex.
And the footage also shows Ronald leaving the complex several hours later than what he told investigators.
He left that apartment about 4 o'clock in the morning. So his version saying he was left at between 7:30 or 8 o'clock is not corroborated through the video at the front gate. He stayed there from the time of that fight until 4 o'clock in the morning, and Miss Demings is on the floor. If she's still alive, is she dead? He remains in that house with her and never calls 911. So that was something that I felt was very damning.
There was only one person who could have done it, one person who had motive, and that was Ronald.
And now police believe they have what they need to charge him with the crime.
Ronald was arrested for second-degree murder. There's a distinction in degrees between first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter, and it all turns to intent.
I don't believe it was a first-degree murder. I don't believe that he planned to do this. I believe that maybe she did hit him and he lost his cool.
And as investigators prepare for trial, they learn Ronald had a dangerous pattern of manipulation that started long before he met Rochelle.
Detectives spoke with the friend in Orlando that Ronald claimed to stay with after the murder.
He agreed to come to the Orlando Police Department, where he provided us a statement as well. He talked about Mr. Gamble being a manipulator who always has different women in and out of his life.
As long as I've known him, he has gone from one woman to another and moved in and used them to help pay bills.
Finding out the type of person that Ronald was, he really didn't want anything to do with him.
So he was surprised when Ronald showed up at his Orlando home unannounced on the morning of December 14th.
Ronald told him that he needed help getting a one-way ticket to California.
One way?
Yep, one way.
Also, he said that Mr. Gamble got a new phone, or he saw him changing out the SIM card to his phone.
At no point did Ronald mention the fight that he had with Rochelle before he left.
So why did Ronald return to the scene of the crime instead of skipping town?
You're wondering, well, then why did you come back? I guess in the end, he knew he had to come back because where was the car? Where's their car gone? And we would have been able to track that. So he had to come back and do something. He had to come back and have some sort of explanation. And then he just wanted to minimize his involvement in it the best he could. So he's kind of like a narcissist. He wanted to talk. He wanted to tell us his story.
In September 2023, Ronald Gamble's trial for second-degree murder gets underway. Prosecutors paint a picture of a resentful and jealous man who was bitter about Rochelle's unconditional love for her son.
Ronald didn't have that kind of relationship with his mother. It seemed very foreign to him. It seems like an attack. It seems like a threat.
The prosecution asserts that when Ronald saw the letters addressed to Dan, his frustrations exploded.
With Ronald's history of having unstable relationships, being impulsive, he does have the tendency to allow jealousy to come forth and manipulate his decisions. So with the rage, finding out that you are possibly lying to me because I saw the letter, that rage takes over.
You have such ill will, hatred, and spite that you take someone's life. And that is what Ronald Gamble did.
His story of, I just hit her once or twice real hard, the injuries are not consistent with somebody just hitting you twice. That's not what happened. He smashed her head into the floor, which caused her death.
But Rochelle didn't die right away.
The question you have in the back of your mind is that if he did call 911 after he struck her, could she have survived her injuries? Could she still be with us today?
When it's the defense's turn, they argue that what happened to Rochelle was a tragic accident.
Their entire strategy at trial was to lessen the impact. They said, yes, he caused her death, but it wasn't murder, it was manslaughter. He didn't intend for her to die.
And to everyone's surprise, the jury agrees.
The jury actually had mercy on him, and he ended up getting convicted with manslaughter.
Rochelle's family is crushed because the manslaughter sentence only requires 3 years. Thankfully, the judge didn't go easy on Ronald, and she sentences him to the maximum, which is 15 years for manslaughter.
But since he's getting credit for time already served, he will be eligible for parole in 2035.
It's infuriating. It's not enough for this angel, for this star, this bright light to have been just blown out like that.
October has a way of changing the sound of a city. In the north of England, autumn settles quietly. The wind slips through rows of brick houses, carrying the scent of wet pavement and coal smoke. Streetlights flicker to life long before the evening feels finished, throwing pale circles of amber across empty sidewalks. People hurry home with collars turned up against the cold. Shopkeepers pull down metal shutters. Buses groan through the narrow streets of Leeds before disappearing into the gathering darkness. At first glance, everything appears ordinary. A city breathing through another ordinary night. A place where tomorrow is expected to arrive exactly as yesterday did. But history has a cruel habit of hiding its darkest chapters behind evenings that look completely unremarkable. There are crimes that horrify because of their violence. There are crimes that linger because of the mystery they leave behind. Then there are crimes that slowly reshape an entire nation, not in a single moment, but one fearful night after another. This is one of those stories. For nearly 5 years, women across northern England would begin measuring distance differently. A walk that once felt harmless suddenly became a calculation. Which streets still had people? Which bus stop was too isolated? Was it safer to cross the road, or stay where the streetlights were brighter? Ordinary decisions became survival decisions. Every unfamiliar engine slowing beside the curb demanded attention. Every pair of footsteps behind them seemed just a little too close. Fear stopped being an emotion. It became part of everyday life. The newspapers searched desperately for a name that could explain the nightmare unfolding across Yorkshire. Eventually, they settled on one that echoed through history with disturbing familiarity. The Yorkshire Ripper. A headline powerful enough to terrify millions, yet far too small to contain the grief carried by the families whose lives had already been shattered. Long before detectives filled conference rooms with maps and evidence files, before helicopters searched empty fields, before one of the largest murder investigations in British history consumed enormous public resources, there were mothers waiting for daughters who never came home. Children wondering why bedtime stories had suddenly stopped. Husbands staring through rain-covered windows, convinced that one more passing car might finally bring someone they loved back through the front door. Those moments rarely become the center of famous crime stories. History often remembers the investigation, the courtroom, the notorious nickname. The quieter tragedies fade into the background. Yet those silent moments are where this story truly begins. Because behind every statistic is a person whose future simply ended. 13 women would lose their lives. Several others would survive attacks that left physical wounds and emotional scars lasting decades. Countless families would never again experience an ordinary Christmas, an ordinary birthday, or an ordinary Sunday afternoon without remembering the empty chair at the table. The man responsible would later become one of Britain's most infamous serial killers. His name would fill books, documentaries, psychological studies, and endless debates about criminal profiling and investigative failure. But this story does not begin with him. It begins with a city that believed it was safe. It begins with streets that seemed familiar. It begins with women who had every reason to expect they would wake up the next morning. In the mid-1970s, Northern England was already carrying heavy burdens. Factories struggled. Economic uncertainty lingered over working-class communities. Long shifts, shrinking paychecks, and growing unemployment shaped everyday conversations in pubs and kitchens alike. Families adapted because they had to. Hardship was familiar. Violence of this kind was not. Even after sunset, life continued. Taxi drivers searched for their final passengers. Hospital workers ended exhausting shifts. Students laughed as they crossed university campuses. Friends said goodnight outside local pubs. Street cleaners prepared for another morning. The rhythm of ordinary life continued because ordinary life always does, until something interrupts it so completely that every memory afterward is divided into before and after. At first, the attacks seemed isolated. Police officers looked for explanations that made sense within existing assumptions. Individual murders. Individual motives. Individual investigations. But the pattern refused to disappear. Instead, it expanded. Each new crime carried echoes of the last. The injuries. The locations. The timing. The terrifying efficiency with which the attacker appeared and vanished back into the darkness. Weeks became months. Months became years. Fear spread faster than facts. Rumors traveled through neighborhoods before official statements ever reached the public. Parents warned daughters not to walk alone. Friends insisted on accompanying one another home. Employers adjusted working hours. Taxi companies noticed more women refusing to travel alone. Universities discussed safety with increasing urgency. The fear did not arrive overnight. It accumulated, one headline at a time, until it settled permanently over Yorkshire like the low grey clouds that so often filled its skies. For investigators, every new crime scene carried the same haunting question. Was this the night they had finally arrived too late again? Every unanswered question made the next investigation even more urgent. Every missed opportunity grew heavier. Every incorrect assumption became more dangerous. Years later, many would look back and ask how a killer could remain unidentified for so long. The answer is neither simple nor comforting. It is a story of fragmented evidence, overwhelming public pressure, mistaken assumptions, false leads, and investigative decisions that would later face intense scrutiny. It is also a reminder that serial murder investigations are rarely solved through dramatic moments of cinematic brilliance. More often, they unfold through exhaustion, uncertainty, human error, persistence, and chance. But none of those answers existed in the autumn when the first families began waiting for loved ones who would never return. On those nights, no one knew they were witnessing the opening chapter of one of the darkest criminal investigations in modern British history. No one knew that detectives would eventually collect hundreds of thousands of statements. No one knew that thousands of men would be interviewed. No one knew that letters, tape recordings, and misleading messages would divert precious investigative resources for years. No one knew that the real killer would, astonishingly, come into contact with police multiple times before finally being identified. History often creates the illusion that disasters are inevitable, that warning signs were obvious from the beginning. Reality is rarely so clear. People living through history almost never recognize it while it is happening. They simply continue living their ordinary lives until ordinary life quietly disappears. Some stories begin with a scream. Some begin with a gunshot. This one begins with silence. The silence of nearly empty streets after midnight. The silence inside homes where someone is expected back any minute. The silence of detectives staring at photographs, hoping the smallest overlooked detail might finally reveal a face. And perhaps the most devastating silence of all, the silence left behind after a family realizes that hope has finally run out. This is not simply the story of a serial killer. It is the story of a community that gradually learned what sustained fear feels like. It is the story of women whose lives mattered long before they became victims. It is the story of investigators confronting a crime unlike anything Britain had previously experienced on such a scale. And it is the story of how one prolonged investigation changed policing, public trust, and the conversation surrounding violence against women for generations to come. Before there was a name that newspapers could print in oversized black letters, before courtroom sketches and televised reports carried a familiar face across the country, there was only darkness, uncertainty, and a question that seemed impossible to answer. Who was hunting the women of Yorkshire? That question would haunt northern England for years. The answer, when it finally came, would reveal not only the identity of a murderer, but also the cost of every missed chance, every mistaken belief, and every life that could never be restored. If fear had a geography, northern England in the late 1970s would have been one of its clearest maps. It did not arrive all at once like a storm rolling over the hills. It spread quietly, neighborhood by neighborhood, conversation by conversation, until it settled into the routines of everyday life. Women who had spent years walking home alone after work suddenly asked colleagues to wait with them for the bus. Taxi drivers noticed more passengers checking the rear window before getting into the car. Husbands stayed awake longer than usual, listening for the sound of a key turning in the front door. Mothers stood at their windows a little longer each evening, watching until their daughters disappeared around the corner, hoping they would soon return the same way. The city itself had not changed. The same brick terraces lined the streets. The same factories released smoke into the cold northern air. The same church bells marked the passing hours on Sunday mornings. Yet everything felt different because danger had become invisible. It was no longer tied to a particular neighborhood or a certain kind of person. It was hidden somewhere between familiar streets and ordinary nights, waiting for the moment when routine became vulnerability. Fear has a remarkable ability to rewrite memory. People would later look back and convince themselves that the warning signs had always been there. They would remember strange cars they had barely noticed, unfamiliar faces they had passed without concern, moments that seemed insignificant until tragedy gave them new meaning. But at the time, those moments were simply part of life. No one crossing a rain-soaked street believed they were walking through a chapter that would one day fill history books. Newspapers became daily rituals of anxiety. Families unfolded the morning edition not only to read the headlines, but to see whether another woman had disappeared, whether another body had been discovered, whether police finally had a breakthrough. Every fresh report carried the same uneasy rhythm. Another victim. Another investigation. Another appeal for witnesses. Another promise that detectives were pursuing every lead. The words began to blur together, but the fear did not. Children noticed it even when adults tried to hide it. Curtains were drawn earlier. Doors were locked before sunset. Conversations stopped when young ears entered the room. Television broadcasts that once faded into the background now held everyone's attention whenever the newsreader mentioned another development in the investigation. Parents who once encouraged independence became cautious. They insisted on phone calls after work. They arranged rides instead of allowing late-night walks. They invented excuses to keep loved ones from traveling alone. Entire communities slowly adjusted their behavior without ever holding a meeting or making a formal decision. It happened naturally, almost instinctively. Human beings have always adapted to danger, even when they cannot see it. Yet the greatest burden fell upon women whose daily lives continued despite the growing atmosphere of uncertainty. Nurses still worked overnight shifts. Students still attended evening lectures. Restaurant staff still finished work long after darkness had settled across the city. Some women simply could not avoid walking home after midnight because bills still needed paying, children still needed feeding, and life offered very few alternatives. It is easy, decades later, to imagine that everyone should have stayed inside. Reality was far more complicated. Most people did not have that luxury. Public transportation followed fixed schedules. Cars remained beyond the financial reach of many working families. Jobs could not simply be abandoned because newspapers carried frightening headlines. Life continued because survival demanded it. Meanwhile, detectives worked inside crowded offices where walls gradually disappeared beneath photographs, maps, handwritten notes, and strings connecting locations that seemed meaningful one day and irrelevant the next. Every phone call carried the possibility of becoming the breakthrough they desperately needed. Every witness interview offered hope before often dissolving into another unanswered question. The investigation expanded with astonishing speed. More officers. More paperwork. More interviews. More evidence. Yet more information did not necessarily create more clarity. Instead, investigators found themselves drowning beneath an ever-growing sea of details. Thousands of names. Thousands of addresses. Countless statements that sounded convincing until they collided with conflicting accounts from someone else. Every new piece of information demanded time, attention, and resources. Every decision about what to prioritize also meant deciding what would have to wait. Pressure mounted from every direction. Political leaders demanded results. Journalists demanded answers. Families demanded justice. The public demanded safety. Few people stopped to consider that detectives themselves were living under the same shadow as everyone else. They also had wives, daughters, sisters, and friends. They also drove home after exhausting shifts wondering whether tomorrow would begin with another crime scene. As weeks turned into months, frustration grew louder. How could one man continue disappearing into the darkness? How could he move through crowded cities without attracting attention? How could so many clues still fail to reveal a face? Those questions echoed not only inside police headquarters but across dining tables, factory floors, classrooms, and pubs throughout northern England. Speculation flourished where certainty could not. Some believed the killer must possess military training. Others imagined he worked nights. Some insisted he knew every alley and side street by heart. Others argued he had to be an outsider who appeared only briefly before vanishing again. Each theory sounded plausible because none could be disproven. This uncertainty became one of the investigation's greatest enemies. Human beings naturally seek patterns. We prefer stories that make sense, motives that feel understandable, villains who fit familiar expectations. But real investigations rarely unfold with such convenience. Facts arrive incomplete. Witnesses remember different details. Physical evidence tells only part of the story. Detectives must constantly distinguish between what they know, what they suspect, and what they merely hope might be true. In this case, that distinction would become critically important. Early assumptions about who faced the greatest danger shaped investigative priorities in ways that would later receive intense scrutiny. Those assumptions influenced public messaging, media coverage, and even the confidence with which certain theories were pursued. As more attacks occurred, the reality proved more complex than anyone had first imagined. The consequences of misunderstanding a pattern are measured not only in investigative delays but in human lives. That is one of the most difficult truths surrounding this case. Looking back with decades of hindsight, it is tempting to judge every mistake as obvious. Yet history is rarely experienced with the clarity that hindsight provides. Investigators worked within the knowledge available to them, under immense pressure, using forensic methods that were still developing by modern standards. Some decisions reflected the limitations of the era. Others reflected assumptions that deserved to be questioned. Those distinctions matter because true crime is not simply about identifying villains. It is also about understanding institutions, understanding culture, understanding why certain voices are heard while others are dismissed, understanding how fear can distort judgment as effectively as any deliberate deception. Years later, many survivors and relatives would speak less about the notoriety of the killer than about the long shadow left behind. They remembered birthdays marked by absence, family photographs that would never again include everyone, empty bedrooms preserved for months because no one could bear to change them, holiday dinners interrupted by moments of silence that required no explanation. Grief rarely announces itself dramatically. Sometimes it appears in unopened letters. An extra cup left in the cupboard. A telephone number that no one has the heart to erase. A coat still hanging by the front door because moving it somehow feels like letting go. Those quiet details rarely appear in police reports, yet they often tell us more about the true cost of violence than any courtroom transcript ever could. As this story unfolds, there will be investigations, forensic evidence, interviews, mistakes, breakthroughs, and justice pursued through the legal system. But beneath every development lies a simpler truth that should never be forgotten. Every headline represented a person. Every case file once belonged to someone with plans for tomorrow. Every name was spoken by people who loved them long before the rest of the country learned who they were. And before Britain came to know the name that would dominate newspapers for years, there was another name, one belonging not to a killer, but to a woman whose ordinary evening would become the beginning of an extraordinary tragedy. In the next chapter, we leave behind the growing atmosphere of fear and meet the people whose lives stood at the very heart of this story, because understanding who they were is the only way to understand what was truly taken away. The story you are about to hear has been told many times. It has appeared in books, documentaries, newspaper archives, courtroom records, and academic studies examining criminal investigation, forensic practice, and the psychology of violent offenders. Yet the longer this case remains in public memory, the easier it becomes for the focus to drift toward the figure at its center, the man whose crimes earned a name recognized around the world. Familiarity has a strange effect on history. The more often a notorious name is repeated, the quieter every other name becomes. This account chooses a different path. It begins where every true crime story should begin, with the lives that existed before violence interrupted them. Long before detectives assembled evidence boards, before reporters waited outside police headquarters for another statement, before courtrooms filled with journalists and grieving families, there were ordinary mornings that seemed destined to remain ordinary forever. Alarm clocks rang before dawn. Children hurried downstairs for breakfast. Factory whistles signaled the beginning of another shift. Couples argued over small inconveniences and forgot them before dinner. Friends promised to meet the following weekend without imagining that the promise might never be kept. Those moments matter because they remind us that history is never experienced as history in the moment it happens. No one wakes up expecting to become part of a national tragedy. No parent kisses a daughter goodbye believing those few seconds may become their final memory. No child imagines that one ordinary evening will divide life into everything before and everything after. For years, communities across Yorkshire searched for certainty while living with uncertainty. They searched for explanations where none yet existed. They searched for reassurance that tomorrow would finally be different. Instead, tomorrow often brought another headline, another investigation, another family forced into a grief they had never imagined. The fear created by these crimes reached far beyond the crime scenes themselves. It reshaped behavior, altered public debate, exposed weaknesses in investigative systems, and challenged assumptions about who society chooses to protect, who receives sympathy, and whose stories are allowed to be forgotten. Those questions remain relevant long after the investigation ended, which is why this case continues to be studied decades later, not only as the story of a serial murderer, but as a reflection of an entire society confronting its own limitations. There are no simple lessons waiting at the end of this journey. There is no satisfying explanation capable of balancing the loss endured by so many families. Justice, when it eventually arrived, could establish responsibility. It could impose punishment. It could close a legal case. It could never restore the lives that had already been taken. That distinction is important. True crime should never invite us to admire violence or become fascinated by suffering for its own sake. Its value lies elsewhere. It asks difficult questions about human behavior, institutional failure, resilience, and memory. It challenges us to look beyond sensational headlines and recognize the people whose futures disappeared beneath them. As we move forward through this story, there will be moments of uncertainty, frustration, and profound sadness. There will also be examples of extraordinary perseverance from investigators, survivors, journalists, and families who refused to allow these women to be remembered only as victims. Their determination ensured that behind every case number remained a human being whose life deserved to be known in full. Because in the end, this is not merely a story about how one man committed a series of terrible crimes. It is a story about how an entire region endured years of fear. How assumptions can shape investigations in ways that carry lasting consequences. How ordinary lives possess extraordinary value. And how the pursuit of truth often continues long after a courtroom delivers its final verdict. Before we examine the investigation, before the evidence, before the mistakes and the breakthroughs, we must first return to the beginning, to the women whose lives formed the heart of this case. Only by understanding who they were can we understand the true weight of what Northern England lost during those long years of uncertainty. And that is where our story truly begins. Northern England in the mid-1970s was a region defined by resilience. Across West Yorkshire, mill towns and industrial cities had been built on generations of hard work. Rows of red brick terraced houses stretched along narrow streets, their chimneys standing as reminders of an economy powered by coal, steel, textiles, and manufacturing. For many families, life followed familiar rhythms. Factory whistles marked the beginning of the workday. Children walked to school along streets where nearly everyone knew their neighbors. Small corner shops served the same customers each morning, and local pubs filled with workers at the end of long shifts. Yet beneath this appearance of routine, Britain was experiencing profound economic and social change. Rising unemployment, inflation, and industrial disputes placed considerable pressure on working-class communities throughout Yorkshire. Families adapted by taking extra shifts, working irregular hours, or juggling multiple jobs. Evening work and overnight employment were common, particularly in hospitals, factories, hotels, and public services. Many people relied on buses or walked home after dark because private cars remained beyond the reach of many households. Cities such as Leeds, Bradford, Halifax, Huddersfield, and Sheffield were closely connected by road and rail, but they each retained distinct identities. Leeds had become an important commercial centre while still carrying its industrial heritage. Bradford remained closely associated with the textile industry despite economic decline. Smaller towns surrounding these cities shared similar landscapes of terraced housing, warehouses, railway lines, and canals that cut through neighbourhoods before disappearing into open countryside. Street lighting in many residential areas was limited by modern standards. Long stretches of road could feel isolated after midnight, particularly during the autumn and winter months when darkness arrived early. Shift workers, nurses, cleaners, hospitality staff, and others whose employment required late hours often completed their journeys home alone. For most, these routines were simply part of daily life rather than conscious acts of risk. Public attitudes toward violence against women also reflected the era. Crimes involving women were sometimes viewed through assumptions that investigators and journalists would later be criticized for. Victims who worked in the sex trade, for example, often received less sympathetic media coverage than would be expected today. Those attitudes influenced public discussion and, in some respects, affected the early direction of the investigation. Historians and criminologists have since examined these assumptions as an important factor in understanding both the public response and the investigative challenges surrounding the case. Before the crimes that would later dominate national headlines, Yorkshire was not a region living in constant fear. Parents expected their children to return home after school. Friends arranged to meet in local pubs without giving much thought to the walk home. University students attended evening lectures, and hospital staff completed overnight shifts as they had done for years. Ordinary routines continued because there was little reason to imagine they would soon be overshadowed by one of the largest criminal investigations in British history. That sense of normality is essential to understanding the impact of what followed. The fear that eventually spread across northern England did not emerge in a single night. It developed gradually, as isolated tragedies began to reveal a pattern that few initially recognized. Each new case added another layer of uncertainty, slowly transforming familiar streets into places viewed with growing caution. The change was not only physical but psychological, affecting how people traveled, worked, and perceived their own communities. By the autumn of 1975, neither the public nor the police understood that they were standing at the beginning of a case that would reshape British policing, influence future homicide investigations, and leave a lasting mark on discussions about violence against women for decades to come. The first chapter of that story would begin not with a famous headline, but with the life of an ordinary woman whose family expected her to come home. By the mid-1970s, policing in England was also undergoing a period of transition. Computerized record systems were still in their infancy, and most investigations depended on handwritten notes, paper files, physical maps, and communication between individual police forces. Information that today could be shared in seconds often required telephone calls, mailed documents, or face-to-face meetings. As a result, major investigations involving multiple jurisdictions presented significant logistical challenges. West Yorkshire was served by a relatively new police force, formed after local government reorganisation in 1974. Officers assigned to homicide investigations were experienced in dealing with serious crimes, but the concept of a prolonged serial murder investigation spanning several counties was unfamiliar territory. Modern techniques such as national DNA databases, widespread CCTV coverage, mobile phone location data, and automated license plate recognition did not exist. Detectives relied heavily on witness statements, forensic examinations available at the time, neighborhood inquiries, and careful comparison of evidence from individual crime scenes. The media played an increasingly influential role in shaping public understanding of criminal investigations. Television news reached millions of viewers each evening, while regional and national newspapers competed to publish the latest developments. As public concern grew, journalists devoted extensive coverage to the investigation, often reporting police appeals for information alongside speculation from outside commentators. This intense attention helped generate valuable leads but also increased pressure on investigators to demonstrate progress. For women living and working across northern England, everyday decisions gradually became more complicated. Many employers began encouraging staff to leave work in pairs where possible. Universities discussed personal safety with students, and some families adjusted household routines to reduce the need for late-night travel. These changes did not occur because authorities immediately understood the scale of the threat. Rather, they reflected a growing awareness that several serious attacks shared troubling similarities, even before the full pattern became clear. It is also important to understand the diversity of the communities affected. The victims came from different backgrounds, occupations, and stages of life. Some were mothers supporting families, some were students pursuing education, and others worked in occupations that required them to be outdoors late at night. Historians have emphasized that reducing the victims to a single category oversimplifies the case and obscures the individuality of the women whose lives were taken or permanently altered. Later reviews of the investigation would examine how assumptions about victimology influenced early police thinking. At the time, some attacks were initially interpreted through the belief that the offender targeted only women involved in prostitution. As additional victims from different walks of life were identified, that assumption became increasingly difficult to sustain. The evolution of investigators' understanding remains an important subject in criminology because it illustrates how early hypotheses, if held too firmly, can affect investigative priorities. The broader social impact extended well beyond the criminal investigation itself. Public debates emerged regarding women's safety, media representation of victims, and the responsibilities of public institutions during periods of sustained public fear. Community organizations, academics, and advocacy groups would later revisit the case as an example of how societal attitudes can shape both public perception and official responses. Understanding this environment is essential before examining the first homicide attributed to the offender. The investigation did not begin with the benefit of hindsight or with knowledge that a serial offender was operating. It began as a single murder inquiry, approached with the information available at the time. Only through the accumulation of evidence over subsequent months and years did investigators recognize that they were confronting one of the most significant criminal cases in modern British history. The next part of the story shifts from the wider social landscape to the individuals whose lives lay at the heart of the case. Their experiences, families, aspirations, and daily routines provide the human context necessary to understand the true impact of the crimes and why they continue to be remembered decades later. Looking back from the present day, it can be tempting to view the late 1970s through the lens of what eventually became known. The identity of the offender, the sequence of crimes, the investigative errors, and the eventual conviction can create the impression that the outcome was somehow inevitable. Contemporary records show otherwise. At each stage, investigators worked with incomplete information, while members of the public attempted to make sense of events that seemed increasingly difficult to explain. The case also marked an important point in the development of British policing. The scale of the inquiry highlighted the need for improved coordination between police forces, more systematic methods for managing large volumes of information, and clearer processes for evaluating evidence and investigative hypotheses. Subsequent reviews of the investigation influenced discussions about major incident management and contributed to changes in how complex homicide investigations were organized in later decades. Scholars have also noted that the case became a turning point in public conversations about violence against women. Many commentators argued that media coverage and public discourse at the time reflected unequal attitudes toward different groups of victims. These discussions continued long after the criminal proceedings had concluded and remain part of broader research into gender, crime, and criminal justice in the United Kingdom. For the communities of Northern England, however, the lasting legacy was far more personal than institutional. Families remembered empty places at birthdays, holidays, and ordinary gatherings. Friends recalled conversations that ended with plans for the following week, unaware those plans would never be fulfilled. Colleagues remembered familiar faces that suddenly became absent from workplaces where routines otherwise continued. These experiences remind us that the effects of violent crime extend well beyond the conclusion of an investigation. Historical accounts of the case therefore serve two purposes. They document the actions of law enforcement and the operation of the criminal justice system, but they also preserve the stories of the people whose lives were interrupted. Maintaining that balance is essential. While the investigation has been studied extensively for its procedural lessons, the individuals who lost their lives should remain central to any account of the case. With this broader context established, the narrative can now move from the social and historical setting to the people at its heart. Understanding who the victims were, their families, occupations, ambitions, and everyday lives provides the foundation for understanding the true impact of the crimes. Rather than beginning with notoriety, the next section begins with ordinary lives, because it is those lives, not the offender's reputation, that define the lasting significance of this case. One of the enduring challenges in documenting major criminal cases is that public attention often becomes concentrated on the offender. Names, photographs, and courtroom proceedings are remembered, while the people who were harmed gradually become reduced to brief descriptions in case summaries. Historians, journalists, and victim advocates have increasingly emphasized the importance of reversing that perspective. In the case of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, each victim had a life, relationships, responsibilities, and aspirations that existed long before the crimes occurred. The first woman whose killing was later linked to the series was Wilma McCann, who was 28 years old at the time of her death in October 1975. She was a mother of 4 young children living in Leeds. Like many people facing financial hardship during the economic difficulties of the 1970s, she struggled to provide for her family. Contemporary reporting and later historical accounts note that her circumstances were shaped by limited economic opportunities and the demands of supporting children. Any understanding of her life requires acknowledging those broader social conditions rather than defining her solely through the circumstances of her death. Accounts from family members and researchers describe Wilma as someone whose children were central to her life. The practical realities of raising a family under financial pressure required difficult decisions, and those pressures were not uncommon in parts of northern England during that period. Many households experienced unstable employment, rising living costs, and limited access to social support. These conditions formed part of the backdrop against which countless ordinary families attempted to build stable lives. Subsequent victims also came from varied backgrounds, illustrating that no single description could capture the people affected by the offender's crimes. Some were employed in healthcare or office work, some were students pursuing higher education, and others were mothers balancing work and family responsibilities. Their ages, occupations, and personal circumstances differed considerably. This diversity became increasingly important as investigators reassessed early assumptions about victim selection. Modern historical analysis encourages readers to consider these women as individuals rather than as entries in a chronology of crimes. They belonged to families, workplaces, neighborhoods, and communities. They had friendships, interests, routines, and future plans that were interrupted by violence. Remembering those aspects of their lives helps provide a more accurate and humane understanding of the case than focusing exclusively on the offender or the investigation. The relatives of many victims have spoken over the years about the lasting consequences of their loss. Beyond the immediate grief, families faced anniversaries, birthdays, graduations, weddings, and other milestones marked by absence. For children who lost a parent, the effects extended into adulthood. Siblings, parents, friends, and colleagues likewise carried the impact of the crimes in ways that rarely appear in official investigative records. This perspective has influenced more recent approaches to true crime reporting and documentary filmmaking. Rather than centering notoriety, many contemporary works seek to restore attention to the victims themselves, placing their lives and experiences at the forefront. In doing so, they contribute to a fuller historical record, one that recognizes not only the significance of the criminal investigation but also the humanity of those whose lives were permanently changed. As the investigation expanded, it became increasingly clear that the women affected by the offender could not be understood through a single stereotype. They differed in age, occupation, family circumstances, and personal histories. Some were raising children, some were pursuing education, and others were building careers or supporting relatives. This diversity challenged early assumptions about the offender's victim selection and underscored the importance of evaluating evidence without relying on broad generalizations. Among those later identified as victims were women who had been employed in occupations requiring evening or overnight travel, as well as women whose daily routines reflected the realities of working and living in northern England during the 1970s. Their experiences illustrate how ordinary activities, returning home after work, meeting friends, or traveling through familiar neighborhoods, formed the context in which the crimes occurred. Historical accounts consistently emphasize that these women were engaged in everyday aspects of life rather than extraordinary circumstances. Researchers who have examined the case have also noted the importance of language when discussing victims of violent crime. Describing individuals solely by a single aspect of their lives can obscure the complexity of their identities. Many of the women were remembered by relatives and friends as caring parents, dependable colleagues, supportive sisters, or loyal friends. Family photographs, personal recollections, and interviews conducted years after the investigation often focus on these characteristics rather than on the crimes themselves. The children and relatives of several victims have spoken publicly about the long-term consequences of their loss. Their accounts describe the practical and emotional challenges that followed, including changes in family structure, financial hardship, and the enduring effects of bereavement. Such testimony has contributed to a broader understanding that the impact of homicide extends across generations, affecting not only those directly harmed but also the wider network of family members and communities connected to them. From a historical perspective, the Yorkshire investigation also prompted reflection on how victims are represented in public discourse. Scholars and journalists have argued that media coverage during the 1970s sometimes drew distinctions between victims based on occupation or lifestyle in ways that would later be widely criticized. Subsequent analyses have emphasized that all victims deserved equal consideration and that investigative priorities should remain guided by evidence rather than assumptions about social status or personal circumstances. These discussions have influenced later approaches to journalism, criminology, and documentary production. Contemporary accounts are more likely to include biographical information, family perspectives, and social context, helping audiences understand that each victim's life extended far beyond the events that brought them into historical records. This shift reflects a broader recognition that accurate and ethical storytelling requires attention not only to the investigation but also to the people whose lives were irrevocably affected. Remembering the victims as individuals also provides an important framework for understanding the investigation itself. Detectives were not simply attempting to identify an unknown offender, they were responding to repeated losses experienced by real families and communities. Each new investigation represented another family seeking answers, another community confronting uncertainty, and another reminder of the responsibility carried by law enforcement during a major homicide inquiry. As the chronology of the case continued to unfold, investigators gradually recognized that they were dealing with a series of connected crimes rather than isolated incidents. That realization transformed what had begun as individual murder investigations into one of the largest and most complex criminal inquiries in British history. When a criminal case becomes one of the most discussed investigations in a country's history, there is always a risk that the people most affected become lost beneath the scale of the story. The volume of headlines, police reports, courtroom discussions, and public debate can create distance between the audience and the individuals whose lives were changed forever. For the victims of the Yorkshire Ripper case, that distance was particularly significant. Over time, their identities were often connected to the investigation rather than to the lives they had lived before. Yet each woman had a personal history that existed independently of the crimes committed against them. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, colleagues, and friends. They had routines, responsibilities, hopes, and relationships. They were part of communities that knew them not as names in newspapers, but as familiar faces in everyday places. This distinction became especially important as the case developed. Early public discussion often focused on trying to understand the offender's pattern. Investigators and journalists attempted to identify similarities between victims in order to predict future behavior. While identifying patterns is a necessary part of criminal investigation, it also created a danger, reducing individual people into categories. The reality was far more complex. The women affected by the case came from different backgrounds. Their lives reflected the diversity of Northern English communities during the 1970s. Some worked long hours. Some cared for families. Some were seeking opportunities and independence in a changing society. Some faced personal difficulties, while others appeared to be living ordinary lives with familiar hopes and concerns. What connected them was not a shared identity, but the fact that their lives were interrupted by violence. For families, the aftermath of loss was not measured only in the days immediately following a crime. Grief continued through years of ordinary moments. Birthdays arrived with someone missing. Family gatherings carried an absence that could not be explained away. Children grew older while carrying memories of a parent who was no longer there to witness those milestones. The impact of such loss is difficult to capture through official documents. Police files record evidence. Court records record legal arguments. Newspaper articles record public reaction. But none of these can fully describe the experience of a family returning home to a space where someone important should have been. This is why modern discussions of the case increasingly emphasize the importance of victim-centered storytelling. Understanding a crime requires more than understanding the offender's actions. It requires understanding what was taken away. The investigation would eventually become known for its size, its complexity, and the mistakes made along the way. However, behind every investigative decision was a human reality. Families were waiting for answers, communities were seeking reassurance, and victims deserved to be remembered as complete individuals rather than as parts of a criminal timeline. The passage of time has changed many aspects of how society discusses cases like this one. Language has evolved. Attitudes toward victims have changed. There is now greater awareness that a person's occupation, circumstances, or personal struggles should never determine the value placed on their life. The women connected to the Yorkshire Ripper case are remembered not because of how their lives ended, but because their lives existed before that moment. Their stories belong to families who loved them, communities that knew them, and a historical record that should preserve their humanity. As the investigation moved forward, the challenge facing police became increasingly clear. They were no longer dealing with separate incidents that could be examined individually. They were facing a pattern of crimes that demanded coordination, resources, and a new approach. The search for answers would become one of the most extensive investigations Britain had ever seen. The beginning of the Yorkshire Ripper case was not recognized as the beginning of a historic investigation. In October 1975, authorities were responding to what appeared to be a single homicide. There was no nationwide understanding that a larger pattern existed. There was no certainty that the event would become connected to a series of crimes that would occupy police resources for years. At the center of that first investigation was Wilma McCann, a 28-year-old mother from Leeds. Before her name became associated with one of Britain's most significant criminal cases, she was a person with her own history, relationships, and responsibilities. She was known to her family and community as a real individual, not as the first entry in a future criminal timeline. Her death immediately created questions for investigators. Police examined the circumstances surrounding what had happened, collected available evidence, and began speaking with people who may have had information. Like many homicide investigations, the early stages depended on gathering small pieces of information, conversations with witnesses, details from the surrounding area, and attempts to understand the events leading up to the discovery. At that time, investigators did not have the benefit of knowing that they were looking for a serial offender. The concept of a linked series of crimes would only emerge later, after additional incidents revealed similarities. This is a common challenge in complex investigations. The meaning of evidence often changes as new information becomes available. In the months following the first killing, police continued their work while attempting to determine whether there were connections to other crimes. The investigation existed within the limitations of the period. Forensic technology was far less advanced than it is today. There were no national DNA databases, no digital surveillance networks, and no instant methods for comparing information between different police departments. Much of the work depended on traditional investigative methods. Officers conducted interviews, reviewed reports, followed leads from members of the public, and attempted to build a picture of events from incomplete information. Each piece of evidence had to be examined carefully, but investigators were operating in an environment where the full scale of the situation was still unknown. As further attacks occurred, the nature of the investigation changed. What had initially appeared to be an individual case became part of a wider pattern. Similarities between incidents raised concerns that one offender might be responsible for multiple crimes. The pressure on police increased as communities demanded answers and reassurance. The realization that multiple crimes could be connected transformed the investigation from a local homicide inquiry into a major regional operation. Resources expanded. More officers became involved. Information from different cases had to be compared and organized. Decisions made in earlier stages were re-examined as investigators attempted to understand the developing pattern. For the public, the situation created growing uncertainty. People who had previously considered these events isolated began to recognize that something larger was happening. The fear was not only about the crimes themselves but about the unknown identity of the person responsible and the uncertainty surrounding where and when another incident might occur. For investigators, one of the greatest challenges was separating meaningful evidence from coincidence. Large investigations often produce enormous amounts of information. Some details prove important. Others lead nowhere. Determining the difference requires time, experience, and careful judgment. The early years of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation would later become the subject of extensive analysis because they demonstrated both the difficulties of policing a serial offender and the consequences of investigative assumptions. However, behind those institutional lessons were individual tragedies that continued to affect families and communities. Each incident represented another person whose life had been interrupted, another family searching for explanations, and another community forced to confront a level of fear it had not experienced before. The investigation was no longer simply about identifying an offender. It had become a race against time, shaped by uncertainty, public pressure, and the responsibility of preventing further harm. As detectives continued searching for connections, they faced a difficult reality. The person they were looking for was still unknown, the pattern was still developing, and the answers they needed remained hidden among thousands of pieces of information. As the investigation continued into the late 1970s, the most difficult challenge for authorities was no longer simply identifying what had happened at individual crime scenes. The greater challenge was understanding whether these events represented a single pattern. In major criminal investigations, recognizing a connection between separate incidents can change everything. It affects how resources are allocated, how evidence is reviewed, and how investigators attempt to predict future developments. In the Yorkshire Ripper case, that process unfolded gradually. Each new incident forced investigators to revisit previous assumptions. Details that had once appeared unrelated were examined again. Old reports were reopened. Earlier witness statements were reviewed with the possibility that information previously considered insignificant might now hold greater importance. This process was complicated by the reality of policing during the 1970s. Investigators did not have the digital tools that modern detectives rely upon. Information was often stored in physical files, and communication between different teams required significant coordination. A major investigation depended not only on collecting evidence but on ensuring that information reached the right people at the right time. The growing number of cases placed enormous pressure on West Yorkshire Police and other agencies involved. Officers worked extended hours, often dealing with thousands of pieces of information from the public. Every telephone call, letter, and interview had to be assessed. Some information proved valuable. Much of it did not. The difficulty was that investigators could not always know the difference immediately. Meanwhile, communities across northern England experienced a gradual change in daily life. The fear was not limited to the locations where crimes had occurred. It spread through conversations, workplaces, schools, and households. People began discussing personal safety in ways that had previously been unnecessary. Families changed routines. Friends arranged to travel together. The atmosphere reflected a society attempting to adapt while waiting for answers. The public response also placed investigators under intense scrutiny. As each new incident became known, questions grew about whether enough was being done. Newspaper coverage increased, and journalists closely followed every development. The investigation became one of the most visible criminal cases in Britain, creating a level of attention that few police operations had experienced before. However, public attention brought both advantages and difficulties. Media coverage encouraged witnesses to come forward and helped spread police appeals. At the same time, intense reporting sometimes contributed to speculation and pressure for immediate answers. Investigators had to balance the need for public cooperation with the risk that unverified information could distract from the evidence. One of the most significant issues that emerged during this period was the challenge of identifying a consistent pattern. Early theories focused on characteristics shared by some victims, but as the investigation progressed, those theories became increasingly difficult to maintain. The range of victims demonstrated that the offender's choices did not fit a simple explanation. This realization was important because understanding victim selection is often central to identifying an unknown offender. Investigators attempt to determine whether there is a relationship between offender and victim, whether locations have significance, and whether specific behaviors reveal a predictable pattern. In this case, those questions proved unusually difficult. The investigation also revealed the importance of avoiding assumptions. When authorities form an early theory, it can help organize a complex case. But if that theory becomes too fixed, it can create blind spots. Later reviews of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation examined how early interpretations influenced decision-making and how future investigations could reduce similar risks. For the families affected, however, these investigative debates were not abstract questions. They represented the difference between waiting and receiving answers. They represented years of uncertainty and the painful reality that the legal process could not move forward until the person responsible was identified. Behind the thousands of documents, interviews, and investigative meetings were people trying to continue their lives after devastating losses. Communities continued working, children continued growing up, and families continued carrying memories of those who were no longer present. The investigation became larger with each passing year, but the central question remained unchanged. Who was responsible? And how could someone continue to avoid identification despite the enormous effort dedicated to finding him? The answer would eventually come, but not before the investigation experienced some of its most challenging periods. The search for the offender would involve major breakthroughs, but also serious setbacks that shaped how the case is remembered today. By the end of the 1970s, the Yorkshire Ripper investigation had become one of the largest and most demanding criminal inquiries ever undertaken in Britain. What had begun as separate homicide investigations had developed into a national concern, involving multiple police teams, extensive public appeals, and a level of scrutiny rarely experienced by law enforcement at the time. The growing number of cases forced investigators to confront an uncomfortable reality: the offender remained unidentified despite significant effort. The investigation was no longer simply a matter of examining past events. It had become a question of preventing future harm while attempting to understand a person whose identity remained unknown. During this period, police worked to identify connections between incidents by examining locations, timelines, witness accounts, and available forensic information. Investigators searched for recurring details that might reveal the offender's behavior or habits. Every piece of information had to be evaluated carefully because the difference between a useful lead and an irrelevant detail could determine where valuable resources were directed. The scale of the inquiry created practical difficulties. Thousands of officers became involved at different stages. Large volumes of information accumulated, requiring systems for organizing and reviewing evidence. The investigation demonstrated the challenges of managing a major case before the development of many modern technologies that are now considered essential parts of criminal investigation. Public cooperation became a central part of the search. Police repeatedly appealed for witnesses and information, hoping that someone had seen something unusual or remembered a detail that could assist investigators. Communities across Yorkshire were encouraged to remain alert and report anything that might help establish the offender's identity. At the same time, the investigation faced criticism. As months passed without an arrest, questions emerged about whether opportunities had been missed and whether information had been handled effectively. These concerns would become an important part of later reviews of the case, particularly regarding communication, information management, and the dangers of relying too heavily on early assumptions. One of the most significant developments during this period involved communications from an individual claiming responsibility for the crimes. Messages sent to authorities and the media created considerable attention and influenced investigative decisions. The authenticity of these communications became a major issue, and the time spent pursuing them would later be examined as one of the factors that affected the direction of the investigation. The existence of false leads is a recurring challenge in major criminal cases. Investigators must consider all credible information, but they must also determine whether that information is accurate. A misleading claim can consume enormous amounts of time and attention, particularly when public fear is high and the pressure to find answers is intense. For those living in affected communities, the investigation's length created a sense of uncertainty that was difficult to escape. The case was discussed in homes, workplaces, and public spaces. Many people followed developments closely, hoping each announcement would bring resolution. Instead, repeated delays increased frustration and anxiety. Yet alongside fear, there were also examples of resilience. Communities continued to support one another. Families affected by loss worked to preserve the memories of those they had lost. Investigators continued their work despite criticism and setbacks. The search for answers continued because the consequences of failure were measured in human lives. Looking back, the late 1970s represented a period in which the investigation was shaped by both determination and difficulty. The police had committed significant resources, but the complexity of the case exposed weaknesses in investigative methods and coordination. The eventual identification of the offender would not come from a single dramatic discovery. It would result from a combination of circumstances, including routine police work, available evidence, and a moment that changed the direction of the entire investigation. After years of uncertainty, the search was approaching its decisive stage. The question that had remained unanswered for so long, who was responsible, was finally moving closer to an answer. In any major criminal investigation, the moment a case changes direction is often not a dramatic revelation but the careful work that follows a discovery. A location, a statement, a piece of evidence, or an observation that initially appears ordinary can become significant when examined within a wider context. For investigators working on the Yorkshire Ripper case, the process of discovery was not a single event. It was a long accumulation of information, uncertainty, and attempts to understand what the evidence was revealing. Each incident brought investigators back to the same fundamental questions. What had happened? Who was responsible? Were there details connecting one case to another? And perhaps most importantly, was there anything that could have been noticed earlier? During the years of the investigation, police examined countless locations across West Yorkshire and surrounding areas. Crime scenes were carefully documented, witnesses were interviewed, and forensic examinations were conducted using the methods available at the time. Although modern audiences may imagine investigations as being solved through advanced technology, much of police work during this period depended on patience, organization, and the ability to recognize meaningful details among large amounts of information. The process of examining a crime scene involved more than collecting physical evidence. Investigators attempted to reconstruct events by considering the surrounding environment, the timeline, possible movements, and information provided by people who had interacted with the victim before the incident. Each detail contributed to a larger picture, even when that picture remained incomplete. As the number of connected cases increased, the importance of comparison became clear. Investigators began looking beyond individual incidents and searching for similarities. Patterns of location, timing, and circumstances were reviewed in an effort to understand whether the same person could be responsible. However, identifying a pattern in real investigations is rarely straightforward. Some details may appear connected simply because they occur frequently. Others may seem insignificant until later evidence gives them new meaning. Detectives must constantly balance possibilities with proof, avoiding both the danger of overlooking important information and the danger of following every possible theory. The pressure surrounding the investigation also influenced how discoveries were interpreted. The public wanted reassurance. Families wanted answers. The media demanded progress. Under such circumstances, every potential breakthrough carried enormous weight. A new lead could create hope, but an unsuccessful lead could deepen frustration. One of the major challenges was the sheer volume of information generated by the investigation. Thousands of people were interviewed, and enormous numbers of statements and reports were collected. Managing such an amount of material was a significant logistical challenge, especially before the widespread use of modern digital databases. Today, investigators can search millions of records within seconds. In the 1970s, information management relied heavily on physical documentation and human organization. Files had to be reviewed manually. Connections had to be identified through careful comparison. Communication between teams required additional coordination. These limitations did not mean investigators lacked commitment or skill. They reflected the realities of policing during that era. The case became an example of how traditional investigative methods were tested by a crime series of unusual complexity and duration. Beyond the evidence itself, discovery also involved understanding the people affected. Officers conducting inquiries often spoke with families, neighbors, and members of the community who provided important information about victims' lives and routines. These conversations were not simply sources of evidence. They were reminders that every investigation involved real people experiencing real loss. For families, the investigative process could be emotionally difficult. Repeated interviews meant revisiting painful memories. Waiting for updates meant living with uncertainty. The search for answers became part of their lives, sometimes for years. As the investigation moved toward its final stages, one fact remained clear: despite the enormous effort devoted to the case, the identity of the offender had still not been confirmed. The discovery that would eventually bring the investigation closer to a conclusion would not emerge from one simple answer but from circumstances that brought police into contact with the man they had spent years trying to find. That moment would transform the case. After years of searching through evidence, following leads, and confronting setbacks, investigators were finally approaching the point where uncertainty would begin to give way to resolution. By the beginning of 1981, the Yorkshire Ripper investigation had reached a critical stage. Years of work had produced an enormous amount of information, but the central question remained unanswered. The person responsible for the crimes had not been identified, and the pressure surrounding the investigation had never been greater. For investigators, the challenge was not a lack of effort. It was the complexity of the case itself. The inquiry had grown beyond the scale of a typical homicide investigation. It involved multiple locations, countless interviews, large amounts of documentation, and the constant need to evaluate new information while continuing to examine older material. At this stage, police had developed extensive knowledge about the crimes, but knowledge about the offender remained incomplete. They were searching for a person who could exist within ordinary society while being connected to extraordinary acts of violence. This contradiction made the investigation especially difficult. Many serial offenders are not identified because of one single piece of evidence. Instead, identification often occurs when several separate details finally come together. A person's behavior, movements, statements, possessions, or circumstances may appear unimportant individually. When combined, however, they can create a clearer picture. This was the nature of the breakthrough that eventually occurred. On the 2nd of January, 1981, police officers in Sheffield stopped a man during a routine interaction involving a vehicle. At that moment, the officers were not conducting a dramatic final search based on a complete understanding of the case. They were carrying out ordinary police duties. The significance of that encounter only became apparent as events developed. The man was Peter Sutcliffe. The circumstances that brought officers into contact with him became one of the most discussed moments in the history of the investigation. 4 years afterward, questions were raised about how close authorities had previously come to identifying him and why earlier opportunities had not resulted in an arrest. The case became a major example in discussions about investigative judgment, information sharing, and the importance of reassessing evidence. During the police interaction, officers discovered information that raised concerns and led to further examination. The investigation that had lasted for years suddenly entered a new phase. The search was no longer focused on an unknown individual. It was focused on determining whether the person in custody was connected to the crimes that had affected so many lives. For investigators, this moment carried enormous responsibility. A suspicion, even a strong one, was not enough. Evidence had to be carefully examined. Claims had to be tested. Legal procedures had to be followed. The difference between suspicion and proof is one of the foundations of criminal justice. As questioning continued, authorities began comparing available information with the existing investigation records. Details that had been collected over years now had to be viewed through a new perspective. The possibility that the person they had been searching for was finally identified changed the atmosphere of the entire inquiry. For the families of victims, the news represented a complex moment. After years of uncertainty, there was finally the possibility of answers. But identifying a suspect could not undo the years of loss, nor could it restore the lives that had been taken away. The conclusion of a major investigation often brings public attention to the offender and the legal process that follows. However, for those most directly affected, the most important outcome is often much simpler, knowing that responsibility has been established and that the unanswered questions surrounding their loved ones may finally receive a response. The discovery of Peter Sutcliffe's identity marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The investigation shifted from searching for an unknown offender to preparing for prosecution, examining evidence, and establishing the facts that would later be presented in court. After more than 5 years of uncertainty, the case was finally moving toward justice. But before that could happen, investigators and prosecutors faced the difficult task of proving what had occurred and ensuring that the legal process fully examined the evidence. The identification of Peter Sutcliffe in January 1981 represented a turning point, but it was not the end of the investigation. In many ways, it marked the beginning of one of the most important phases, transforming years of suspicion, reports, and investigative material into evidence that could withstand examination in court. For detectives who had spent years working on the case, the moment carried a mixture of relief and responsibility. Finding a suspect answered one question, but it created many others. Could the evidence clearly establish his connection to the crimes? Could investigators reconstruct the sequence of events? Could they provide answers for the families who had spent years waiting for justice? The investigation moved quickly into a detailed review process. Officers examined existing records, revisited previous information, and compared material connected to the suspect with evidence gathered throughout the years. A case of this scale required careful organization because the prosecution would depend not on public belief or suspicion, but on facts that could be presented and challenged in a courtroom. This distinction is central to criminal justice. An arrest is not a conclusion. It is the beginning of a legal process in which evidence must be tested. Investigators must demonstrate what happened, prosecutors must establish responsibility, and the court must determine guilt according to the standards of law. The Yorkshire Ripper investigation also revealed difficult questions about the earlier stages of the case. After Sutcliffe was identified, attention turned toward the numerous occasions when police had interacted with him before his eventual arrest. Reviews of the investigation examined how information had been assessed, how decisions had been made, and whether opportunities had been missed. These questions became part of the broader historical significance of the case. Major investigations are often studied not only because of the crimes themselves but because they reveal how institutions respond under extreme pressure. The Yorkshire Ripper inquiry became an example of the challenges created when investigators must manage enormous amounts of information while facing intense public and political expectations. For the communities affected, however, the discovery had a deeply personal meaning. Many people who had lived with uncertainty for years finally knew that the investigation had reached a decisive stage. Families who had carried unanswered questions could now move toward a legal process that might provide recognition of what had happened. Yet the arrest also brought renewed attention to the victims. Their names and stories returned to public discussion, and many people reflected on the fact that behind the investigation statistics were individual lives. The conclusion of the search did not erase the impact of their losses. Justice could address responsibility, but it could not reverse time. As investigators prepared the case for court, they faced the enormous task of organizing evidence from one of the largest criminal inquiries in British history. Statements, forensic findings, investigative reports, and witness accounts all had to be reviewed and presented in a way that allowed the legal system to examine the facts. The transition from investigation to prosecution also changed the public conversation. For years, attention had focused on uncertainty. Who was responsible? How could the crimes continue? Why had the offender not been found? Now, the focus shifted toward accountability and the legal process. The eventual trial would become one of the most closely followed criminal proceedings in Britain at the time. It would examine not only the evidence against Sutcliffe but also broader questions about criminal responsibility, mental health, and the consequences of repeated violent offences. The discovery of the offender's identity brought an end to the search that had dominated headlines for years. But it also ensured that the story would continue in a different form, one focused on justice, accountability, and the lasting lessons drawn from the investigation. After years of searching through uncertainty, authorities finally had the opportunity to present their case. The next stage would determine how the justice system responded to one of the most significant criminal cases of the 20th century. A major criminal investigation is rarely a straight path from question to answer. It is usually a long process filled with uncertainty, competing theories, incomplete information, and decisions made under pressure. The Yorkshire Ripper investigation became one of the most studied examples of these challenges because of its enormous scale, the length of time involved, and the difficulties faced by investigators attempting to identify an unknown offender. When the first crimes occurred, police did not have the advantage of knowing they were dealing with a serial offender. Each incident had to be approached according to the evidence available at that moment. Detectives were required to determine what had happened, identify possible suspects, and understand the circumstances surrounding each case before a wider pattern became clear. As additional crimes were reported, investigators began searching for connections. The process required comparing information from different locations and different police teams. Similarities had to be identified while avoiding assumptions that could lead the investigation in the wrong direction. This was one of the central challenges of the case, the difference between a useful pattern and a misleading one. Investigators naturally look for repetition. A repeated method, a repeated location type, or a repeated behavior can provide important clues about an offender. However, patterns can also create expectations that do not match reality. If investigators become too committed to one explanation, they risk overlooking information that does not fit their theory. The Yorkshire Ripper investigation would later be examined extensively because of how early assumptions influenced the direction of the inquiry. One major area of criticism involved the belief that the offender primarily targeted a specific group of women. As the investigation continued and victims came from different backgrounds, that understanding became increasingly difficult to maintain. The challenge was not simply identifying mistakes after the fact. It was understanding how those decisions developed within the context of the time. Police were operating without many of the investigative tools available today. There were no national DNA databases, no digital crime analysis systems, and no modern methods of instantly connecting information from different regions. Instead, investigators relied on traditional methods. They conducted interviews, examined physical evidence, reviewed reports, spoke with witnesses, and followed thousands of leads submitted by members of the public. The volume of information became one of the defining features of the investigation. Hundreds of thousands of pieces of information were collected during the inquiry. Each one required assessment. Some provided useful direction. Others turned out to be unrelated. Managing such a large amount of material created significant organizational challenges, especially with the technology available at the time. The investigation also became increasingly affected by public attention. Newspapers followed developments closely, and the public expected progress. Every delay increased frustration. Every new incident intensified demands for answers. For detectives, this created a difficult environment. They had to work under enormous pressure while maintaining the careful standards required for a criminal investigation. A suspect could not simply be identified through public suspicion. Evidence had to support any legal action. Another major challenge came from false information entering the investigation. During the case, communications from someone claiming responsibility for the crimes influenced investigative priorities. The attention given to these messages became one of the most controversial aspects of the inquiry and later contributed to criticism of investigative decisions. False leads are a serious problem in any major criminal case. They create uncertainty because investigators must determine whether information represents a genuine opportunity or a deliberate attempt to misdirect attention. During a high-profile investigation, the consequences of following an incorrect lead can be significant. Despite these difficulties, thousands of officers continued working on the case. They conducted inquiries across communities, reviewed evidence repeatedly, and attempted to bring together information that existed across a vast investigative network. The human cost of the investigation remained at the center of their work. Each file represented a person whose life had been lost, a family searching for answers, and a community affected by fear and uncertainty. The eventual outcome of the case would lead to major discussions about policing methods, investigative management, and the importance of adapting strategies when evidence changes. But before that outcome could occur, investigators had to navigate years of uncertainty and several major obstacles. The search for the truth continued. And within the enormous collection of evidence, reports, and unanswered questions, investigators still needed to find the detail that would finally reveal the identity of the offender. As the Yorkshire Ripper investigation continued, the sheer scale of the operation became one of its defining characteristics. What began as a series of individual police inquiries developed into a complex network involving thousands of officers, multiple departments, and an unprecedented amount of information. The challenge was no longer simply collecting evidence. It was understanding how all of that evidence connected. Large investigations often create a paradox. The more information authorities receive, the greater the possibility of finding the truth. Yet too much information can also make that truth harder to see. Investigators must separate valuable details from background noise, identify patterns without forcing connections, and constantly question whether their current understanding still matches the evidence. This balance proved extremely difficult in the Yorkshire Ripper case. Police received information from a wide range of sources. Members of the public contacted authorities with possible sightings, memories of unusual events, and suspicions about people they knew. Officers conducted extensive door-to-door inquiries in affected areas. Every statement had to be assessed, recorded, and compared with existing information. Some leads helped investigators understand parts of the case. Others created additional work without producing answers. The challenge was that even a seemingly unlikely piece of information could not simply be ignored. In a major investigation, a detail that appears insignificant today may become important when viewed alongside evidence discovered later. The investigation also highlighted the importance of communication between different police teams. Because the crimes occurred across various locations, information needed to move effectively between departments. Any delay, misunderstanding, or failure to connect related information could affect the direction of the inquiry. Later reviews of the investigation identified problems in how information was managed and shared. These findings contributed to broader discussions about the need for improved systems in major criminal investigations. The case became an example of why large inquiries require not only dedication and resources but also clear structures for organizing knowledge. Another significant challenge was maintaining investigative focus. As pressure increased, there was a strong desire to find explanations quickly. Public fear was growing, media attention was intense, and political leaders demanded progress. Under these conditions, investigators faced the difficult task of remaining open to new possibilities while avoiding distractions. One of the most damaging distractions came from false communications sent by an individual claiming to be responsible for the crimes. These messages received significant attention and influenced investigative thinking for a period of time. The person responsible for those communications was later identified as John Humble, who became known for misleading authorities and the media. The impact of this false information was substantial because it created a believable narrative that appeared to explain the offender's identity and behavior. Investigators had to spend valuable time determining whether the communications were genuine or deceptive. The episode became one of the most discussed examples of how misinformation can affect a major criminal investigation. However, focusing only on investigative failures would provide an incomplete picture. Thousands of officers worked under extremely difficult circumstances. Many spent years pursuing leads, interviewing witnesses, and attempting to prevent further harm. The investigation demanded persistence over a period when certainty was rare. For communities across Yorkshire, the investigation created a complicated relationship with the police. Many people appreciated the effort being made, while others questioned why the offender had not been identified sooner. Trust became an important issue as the public searched for reassurance. Families affected by the crimes experienced this period differently from the wider public. For them, the investigation was not simply a national event discussed in newspapers. It was connected to personal grief, unanswered questions, and the hope that accountability would eventually be achieved. The years of investigation also changed how Britain viewed serious crime. The case demonstrated that traditional approaches to policing could be overwhelmed by crimes that crossed geographical boundaries and involved large amounts of information. It encouraged future improvements in major incident coordination, data management, and investigative review processes. By the time the investigation reached its final stage, the police had accumulated years of experience, thousands of reports, and extensive knowledge of the case. Yet the most important breakthrough would not come from a single investigative theory or a dramatic discovery hidden within the files. Instead, it would emerge through circumstances that appeared ordinary at first. A routine police interaction would soon bring investigators face to face with the person they had been searching for. After years of uncertainty, the investigation was about to enter its decisive chapter. By the final months of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, the case had become a defining moment for British policing. It represented years of effort, enormous public attention, and a continuing search for answers that had affected communities throughout northern England. The investigation had expanded to a scale few officers had ever experienced, and the pressure to resolve it had become intense. Yet despite the size of the operation, the fundamental challenge remained the same: identifying the person responsible with evidence strong enough to stand in court. A major criminal investigation is built on accumulation. Rarely does one discovery solve everything. Instead, investigators piece together fragments, statements, timelines, physical evidence, witness accounts, and behavioral patterns until those fragments begin to form a clearer picture. In this case, that process took years. The investigation had generated an enormous archive of material. Officers had interviewed countless individuals, followed numerous leads, and reviewed information repeatedly. Each review carried the possibility of finding something previously overlooked, but it also required careful judgment. Investigators had to decide which details deserved further attention and which had already been exhausted. The pressure created by the length of the investigation was significant. Every unsolved case created another reminder that victims' families were still waiting for answers. Every public appeal represented another attempt to encourage someone with relevant information to come forward. Every new report had to be considered against the possibility that it might finally reveal the identity of the offender. At the same time, the investigation faced the difficult reality that the offender had remained within ordinary society while authorities searched for him. This raised questions that would continue long after the arrest. How could someone connected to such serious crimes avoid detection for so long, and what lessons could be learned from that failure? These questions became central to later examinations of the case. Investigators, academics, and criminal justice professionals analyzed the decisions made during the inquiry, not simply to assign blame, but to understand how future investigations could improve. One of the most important lessons was the danger of allowing a single theory to dominate an investigation. Early interpretations can be useful because they provide direction. However, as new evidence appears, those interpretations must be reconsidered. A successful investigation requires the ability to adapt. The Yorkshire Ripper inquiry also demonstrated the importance of effective information management. In a case involving hundreds of thousands of pieces of information, systems for organizing, comparing, and sharing evidence are essential. Modern policing has incorporated many technological and procedural improvements partly because of lessons learned from investigations of this scale. While the public often remembers investigations through moments of discovery and arrest, the reality is that most of the work occurs in uncertainty. Officers spend long periods following leads that do not produce answers. They examine possibilities that turn out to be incorrect. They continue despite criticism and exhaustion because the responsibility remains. The families affected by the case experienced this uncertainty in a deeply personal way. For them, the investigation was measured not in reports or statistics, but in years without closure. The eventual arrest of a suspect brought a significant change, but it also marked the beginning of another difficult process, ensuring that the evidence could establish the truth in court. When Peter Sutcliffe was finally identified in January 1981, the investigation entered its final phase. The search for an unknown offender was ending. The focus shifted toward examination, prosecution, and justice. The case had revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the criminal justice system. It showed the dedication of investigators working under extraordinary pressure, while also exposing the consequences of mistakes, assumptions, and communication failures. More than anything, it demonstrated the human cost of unresolved crime. Behind every investigative decision was a family waiting. Behind every report was a person whose life had mattered. Behind every question was the need for answers. The next stage would move from investigation to the courtroom, where evidence gathered over years would be examined publicly and responsibility would be determined through the legal system.